The summer contract. 19-year-old Lydia Hale stood in the scorching Montana sun, her trembling hand hovering over a contract that would sell her future for $300. The ink wasn't even dry on her father's death certificate, but the debt collectors wouldn't wait. Her mother's desperate eyes pleaded silently from the porch, while her younger siblings clung to her skirts, unaware that their sister was about to become the price of their survival. In 3 days, she would board a stagecoach bound for Silver Ridge Ranch to marry a widowed stranger with 5 children. A man who needed a solution, not a wife. This wasn't a love story. This was a transaction. But sometimes, the most beautiful gardens grow from the hardest ground. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. And if her courage moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The Missouri summer of 1875 had no mercy. Heat radiated from the packed earth of the Hale family's small homestead, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon. Lydia stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother's hands tremble as she counted coins for the 3rd time that morning. The pile never grew. It never would. "It's not enough," Margaret Hale whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Lydia already knew. She'd known since the morning they'd buried her father, when Mr. Thornton from the bank had appeared at the graveside with his leather ledger and his practiced expression of sympathy that fooled no one. Thomas Hale had died owing $600, an impossible sum that had grown from seed loans that never produced crops, from medical bills that never healed him, from interest that compounded like a curse. "Mama." Lydia stepped forward, her worn calico dress whispering against the doorframe. "Stop counting. We both know what the number is." Her mother's hands stilled. In the yard beyond the kitchen window, Lydia's 3 younger siblings played in the dirt, their laughter thin and bright against the weight of everything they didn't yet understand. Samuel was 8, the twins, Rose and Ruth, barely 6. They drew patterns in the dust with sticks, creating elaborate designs that the wind would erase before sunset. "There has to be another way," Margaret said, but her words carried no conviction. They'd spent 2 weeks searching for another way. 2 weeks of neighbors offering condolences but no cash, of distant relatives sending prayers but no provisions, of Lydia applying to every respectable household in town for work that didn't exist. The letter had arrived 4 days ago, delivered by Mrs. Brennan from the church auxiliary. It had been folded inside a larger envelope, passed along through some network of frontier women who brokered these arrangements with the efficiency of businessmen and the discretion of confessors. Widowed rancher, 34, seeks capable woman for marriage and household management. 5 children requiring maternal guidance. Silver Ridge Ranch, Montana Territory. Room, board, and board and financial settlement provided. Character references required. No romantic expectations necessary. Lydia had read it once, then folded it away. Margaret had retrieved it from the kindling box that same night. "He's offering $300, her mother had said quietly. Sent immediately upon agreement. The other $300 would be forgiveness of the debt. Mr. Thornton has already confirmed he'd accept this arrangement." The mathematics of desperation were simple and brutal. Lydia's future weighed exactly as much as her family's survival. Now, standing in the kitchen with the August heat pressing through every crack in the walls, Lydia watched her mother's face and saw what love looked like when it had to choose between impossible options. "I'll do it," Lydia said. The words came out steady, which surprised her. Inside, everything was screaming, "Lydia, no! Mama!" Lydia moved across the kitchen, knelt beside her mother's chair, took those trembling hands in her own. "Look at me." Margaret Hale's eyes were red-rimmed, shadowed with grief and sleepless nights. She was 42 but looked 60. The frontier had a way of aging women fast, and widowhood aged them faster. "What choice do we have?" Lydia asked gently. "Really, tell me what choice we have." Her mother's silence was answer enough. "I'm 19, Lydia continued. "I'm strong. I can read and write and keep a house. I can do this." She didn't add the rest, because if I don't, they'll take this house. They'll separate the children. They'll send you to the poorhouse. I can do this because the alternative is watching everything fall apart. You should marry for love, Margaret whispered. Love is a luxury, Mama. We can't afford luxuries right now. The word sounded too old for Lydia's mouth, too resigned for someone who should still have been planning dances and wondering about courtship. But girlhood was another luxury that had died with her father. Margaret pulled her hands free, pressed them against her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Lydia waited, her own throat tight, her own eyes burning. She couldn't afford to cry. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When her mother finally lowered her hands, her expression had shifted into something harder, more practical. Survival required practical. Mrs. Brennan said the man, Mr. Rowan, he's reputable, a good rancher, lost his wife 2 years ago to fever. The children range from 3 to 13. He needs help, legitimate help. It's not, she hesitated. It's not improper. I know. Lydia had asked Mrs. Brennan every question she could think of, searching for warning signs that this was something worse than a business arrangement. But every reference checked, every inquiry confirmed the same thing. Caleb Rowan was exactly what he claimed to be, a desperate father who needed help and was willing to pay for it. The stagecoach leaves in 3 days, Margaret said. Mrs. Brennan will make the arrangements. 3 days. 72 hours until Lydia's life divided into before and after. She stood, smoothed her skirts, looked out the window at her siblings. Samuel had abandoned his stick drawings and was showing the twins how to catch grasshoppers, his young face serious with the responsibility of being the man of the house now. Rose shrieked with laughter when one jumped on Ruth's shoulder. Ruth, quieter, gentler, carefully caught it in her cupped hands to examine it before letting it go. They won't understand, Lydia said softly. They'll understand you saved them, her mother replied. Someday, they'll understand that. The next 3 days moved with the strange dual quality of dragging endlessly and vanishing too fast. Lydia went through the motions of preparation with mechanical precision. Mrs. Brennan brought fabric for 2 new dresses, simple cotton, serviceable, nothing fancy. The women of the church auxiliary arrived to help with sewing, their needles flashing in lamplight while they talked around the truth of what was happening. Montana's beautiful, I hear, Mrs. Schaefer offered, threading a needle with practiced ease. Big skies, clean air. The ranch life suits many women, added Mrs. Kim, her accent still thick despite 15 years in Missouri. Honest work, good work. They were trying to make it sound like an adventure, like Lydia was choosing this. She appreciated the effort even as she resented the necessity. Samuel cornered her on the second day, his eyes too knowing for 8 years old. You're leaving because of Papa's debts, he said. Not a question. Lydia had been folding her few possessions into a battered trunk. She paused, looked at her brother's serious face, and decided he deserved the truth. Yes. Will you come back? I don't know. He processed this with the gravity of a much older child. Will we be okay? Yes. This answer, at least, she could give with certainty. The money from the arrangement will clear the debts. Mama will be able to keep the house. You'll all be safe. But you won't be here. No. The words stuck in her throat. I won't be here. Samuel stepped forward, wrapped his thin arms around her waist, pressed his face against her shoulder. He didn't cry. The Hale children had learned early that crying didn't change circumstances. I'll remember you, he said, muffled against her dress. I'll make sure the twins remember you too. Lydia's careful composure cracked. She sank to her knees, pulled Samuel close, let herself hold him like the child he still was beneath the responsibility he'd been forced to carry. I'll write, she promised. Every month. I'll tell you everything about Montana. And maybe someday, when you're older, you can visit. It was a thin hope, but hope nonetheless. Samuel nodded against her shoulder, and they stayed that way until the light shifted, and Margaret called them for supper. The morning of departure arrived with cruel beauty. The sky stretched endless and blue, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed to mock the heaviness of what was happening. The stagecoach would leave from the depot at noon. Lydia dressed in one of her new dresses, a modest brown cotton with ivory buttons, practical and plain. She braided her dark hair, pinned it in a simple coil at the base of her neck. In the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. She looked older, harder, ready. The trunk was already loaded. Inside it, 2 dresses, 1 nightgown, undergarments, a winter shawl, her mother's extra Bible, a packet of seeds from their garden, a photograph of her father taken before illness had hollowed him out, and a small wooden box containing her grandmother's wedding ring. Everything she owned that mattered, condensed into a space 3 feet by 2 feet by 18 inches. Her family gathered on the porch. Margaret held the twins, one on each hip, though they were really too big for that now. Samuel stood beside them, his jaw set, trying so hard to be brave. Lydia memorized the scene. Morning light on weathered wood, chickens scratching in the yard, the vegetable garden she'd planted in May that she'd never see harvested, the cottonwood tree with the rope swing her father had hung 5 years ago. "The money's already been transferred," Margaret said quietly. "Mr. Thornton confirmed it yesterday. The debts are settled." So it was done. Lydia had been purchased. The transaction was complete. "Mama!" "No." Margaret's voice was fierce, sharp enough to cut through Lydia's composure. "Don't you dare apologize. Don't you dare feel ashamed. You're saving this family. You're the bravest person I know." The twins started crying then, not fully understanding but sensing the grief of the adults around them. Samuel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Lydia felt her own control slipping. "I have to go," she managed. "The coach, I know." Margaret set down the twins, pulled Lydia into an embrace that smelled like lavender soap in desperation. "Write to us. Be safe." And Lydia, she pulled back, gripped Lydia's shoulders, looked fiercely into her eyes. "This doesn't define you. You hear me? How you got there doesn't matter as much as what you do once you arrive." Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. She kissed the twins, hugged Samuel until he squirmed, then picked up her small traveling bag. Mrs. Brennan waited in her wagon, ready to drive Lydia to the depot. The older woman's face was kind but professional. She'd brokered these arrangements before. She knew better than to offer platitudes. Lydia climbed into the wagon without looking back. If she looked back, she'd break. And she couldn't afford to break. The depot was crowded with the usual chaos of frontier travel. Men in dusty work clothes heading to railroad jobs, a family relocating to relatives in Kansas, a sharp-eyed salesman with cases of goods. The stagecoach stood ready, its team of 6 horses stamping and tossing their heads in the heat. "Miss Hale?" The driver approached, consulting a paper. "Lydia Hale?" "Yes." "Got you listed for Silver Ridge, Montana Territory. That right?" "Yes." He gestured to the coach. "We'll be stopping overnight in 3 locations. Journey will take about 6 days, assuming weather holds and we don't have trouble. You got provisions?" Mrs. Brennan handed over a basket. Bread, cheese, dried apples, a canteen of water. "She's prepared." The driver nodded, took Lydia's trunk, secured it to the back of the coach. "Best get settled inside, miss. We leave in 10 minutes. Lydia turned to Mrs. Brennan. "Thank you. For everything." The older woman's eyes were damp. "You write to your mama now. And Lydia, there's no shame in what you're doing. Remember that." Then Lydia was climbing into the coach, settling onto the hard bench seat across from a woman with a sleeping infant and beside a young man who smelled like tobacco and looked half asleep. The door closed. The driver climbed to his seat. The whip cracked. And just like that, Lydia Hale left Missouri behind. The first day of travel was brutal. The coach rocked and jolted over rutted roads, throwing passengers against each other with tooth-rattling force. Dust crept through every gap, coating everything in a fine brown powder. The heat was oppressive, the air inside the coach thick and stale. Lydia watched Missouri roll past through the small window, familiar landscape giving way to unfamiliar territory, mile by mile, hour by hour. She thought about the contract folded in her traveling bag, the legal document that had transformed her from daughter to commodity to wife-in-waiting. This marriage is entered into as a practical arrangement for mutual benefit. The bride agrees to manage household affairs and provide maternal care to 5 minor children. The groom agrees to provide room, board, safety, and a financial settlement of $300, paid in advance to settle family debts. Both parties understand this union is one of convenience, not romance. Expectations will be clearly defined. Respect and propriety will be maintained at all times. Mutual benefit, convenience, respect, and propriety. The language of business applied to something that should have been sacred, but Lydia had stopped believing in should-haves. Should-haves were luxuries, like love and choice and girlhood dreams of being courted properly. She had agreed to this because it was necessary. She would survive it because she was strong. And maybe, if she was very lucky and very careful, she would find a way to build something resembling a life in the spaces between obligation and duty. The coach rumbled on through the summer heat, carrying her toward a future she hadn't chosen but would have to claim as her own. Toward Silver Ridge Ranch, toward Caleb Rowan and his 5 children, toward whatever version of herself she would have to become to make this work. By the 3rd day, every part of Lydia's body ached. The overnight stops at frontier stations offered little comfort: thin mattresses, rough food, the constant noise of travelers and animals. She slept fitfully, always aware of the miles accumulating, always conscious of the distance growing between who she'd been and who she was becoming. She ate sparingly from her provisions, trying to make them last. She spoke little to her fellow passengers. The woman with the infant, Mrs. Garrett, tried to engage her in conversation once, but Lydia's responses were brief enough that the woman eventually gave up. It wasn't rudeness. Lydia simply had nothing to say. What could she talk about? The weather? The landscape? The fact that she was being delivered like cargo to a man who needed her services? On the 4th day, they crossed into Montana territory. The landscape shifted. Bigger skies, wilder terrain, mountains appearing on the horizon like promises or threats depending on perspective. The air tasted different here, sharper and cleaner. The settlements were rougher, more raw. This was the frontier proper, where civilization was still negotiating with wilderness. First time in Montana? The tobacco-scented young man asked, speaking for the first time since boarding. Yes, Lydia replied. It's something, ain't it? All this space? Man could get lost out here and never be found. Lydia thought about being lost and never found. The idea had a certain appeal. What brings you out this way? He pressed. Family, Lydia said shortly, closing down the conversation. The young man shrugged, went back to dozing. Mrs. Garrett gave Lydia a sympathetic look, but said nothing. That night, at the station in Willow Creek, Lydia stood outside under the vast Montana sky and stared up at more stars than she'd ever seen. The Milky Way sprawled across the darkness like spilled cream. The air was cool, almost cold despite the summer season. This land was beautiful and indifferent and enormous. Makes you feel small, doesn't it? A woman's voice came from the shadows. An older woman, Native American, wrapped in a shawl despite the season. She'd been at the station when they arrived, though Lydia didn't know in what capacity. Yes, Lydia agreed. That's not a bad thing, the woman said. Being small means there's room to grow. Lydia looked at her sharply, but the woman's face was kind, not mocking. You running from something or toward something? The woman asked. Neither, Lydia said after a moment. I'm running because I have to. The woman nodded slowly. Ah, the hardest kind of running. She was quiet for a moment, then added, This land, Montana, it doesn't care about your reasons for being here. It only cares what you do once you arrive. Remember that. Then she turned and disappeared into the station building, leaving Lydia alone under the stars. On the 6th day, they reached Silver Ridge. The town was smaller than Lydia had imagined. A single street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow even in August. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke and horse. The coach stopped in front of the general store. The driver climbed down, began unloading trunks. Miss Hale? He gestured to her trunk. This is your stop. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment everything changed. She climbed down from the coach on trembling legs, her traveling dress wrinkled and dusty, her face undoubtedly showing the wear of 6 days on rough roads. She looked around the small town square, searching for what? A sign? A welcoming committee? A man stood near the general store porch, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes and a hat pulled low. He watched the coach with the stillness of someone used to waiting. When Lydia stepped fully into view, he straightened slightly. Their eyes met across the dusty space. Caleb Rowan. It had to be. He approached slowly, his boots stirring small clouds of dust. Up close, Lydia could see the details the letter hadn't conveyed. A weathered face lined from sun and work, dark hair starting to show gray at the temples, eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked older than 34, harder, like the land itself had shaped him. Lydia Hale? His voice was low, rough from disuse or distance or both. Yes. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Rowan? Caleb? He removed his hat briefly, nodded. Welcome to Silver Ridge. Welcome. The words sat strangely in the air between them. Your journey was acceptable? He asked, clearly uncomfortable with small talk. It was fine. Thank you. Silence stretched. They stood there in the middle of the street, two strangers bound by contract and necessity, neither quite sure what to say next. The wagon's this way, Caleb finally said, gesturing toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to two horses. Ranch is about 40 minutes out. The children they're waiting. He loaded her trunk with practiced efficiency, then offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. His palm was calloused, his grip impersonal and brief. They drove out of Silver Ridge in silence. The road wound through grassland dotted with sage and wildflowers, following a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sun. In any other circumstance, Lydia might have found it beautiful. The children, Caleb said abruptly, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't been having. They've had a hard time since Mary, my wife, since she passed. I understand, Lydia said quietly. Do you? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Do you understand what you've agreed to? The question stung with its honesty. Lydia met his eyes directly. I've agreed to manage your household and care for your children. I've agreed to a marriage of convenience and practicality. I've agreed because my family needed the money you offered, and you needed the help I can provide. I understand the terms, Mr. Rowan. I'm not expecting anything beyond what was specified in the contract. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or respect. Fair enough. He returned his attention to the road. Just wanted to be clear. I can't... He stopped, started again. I'm not looking for romance, Miss Hale. I don't have anything left to give in that department. This is a business arrangement. You keep the house, mind the children, and I'll make sure you're provided for. That's the bargain. I'm aware, Lydia said coolly. I didn't come here expecting love, Mr. Rowan. I came here because I had debts to pay and nowhere else to go. Let's not pretend this is anything other than what it is. He nodded shortly. Good. Then we understand each other. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Silver Ridge Ranch appeared on the horizon gradually, first the barn, then the house, then the outbuildings and corrals. It was larger than Lydia had expected, built solid from timber and stone, 2 stories with a wide porch. Fields stretched behind it, already harvested or waiting for harvest. Cattle dotted distant pastures. It was prosperous, well-maintained, the kind of operation that required real work and real management. As the wagon approached, Lydia saw them. 5 children arranged on the porch in descending order like stair steps. The oldest, a girl of 13 or so, stood rigid and suspicious. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, clung to her skirts. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop. Those are my children. Those are my children, not our children, not yet, maybe never. Lydia climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to stand straight, to walk toward the porch with as much dignity as she could manage after 6 days of travel. 5 pairs of eyes watched her approach, 5 faces showing various shades of suspicion, curiosity, fear, resignation. The oldest girl spoke first. "You're the new one," she said flatly. Not a question. An accusation. "I'm Lydia," she replied evenly. "Lydia Hale." She paused, then added, "Or I will be Lydia Rowan, I suppose, once your father and I are married." "We don't need you," the girl said. "We've been doing fine without—" "That's enough, Emma." Caleb's voice cut through the tension. He'd come up behind Lydia carrying her trunk. Mind your manners. Emma's jaw clenched, but she fell silent. Caleb set down the trunk, gestured to each child in turn. Emma, 13. Ben, 11. Clara, 8. James, 5. And the baby's Alice, she's 3. 5 children. 5 lives disrupted by their mother's death, now being disrupted again by a stranger's arrival. Hello, Lydia said softly. I know you don't know me. I hope we can… She stopped. What? Hope they could what? Be friends? Become a family? Those were lies, and children knew lies. She started over. I hope we can find a way to make this work. Emma's expression didn't soften. Ben looked away. Clara stared at the porch boards. James pressed closer to Emma. Only little Alice showed any curiosity, peering at Lydia from behind Emma's skirts with wide, dark eyes. Show her to the spare room, Caleb said to Emma. She'll need to wash up and rest. He didn't wait for response before turning away, heading toward the barn as if escaping. Emma picked up Lydia's trunk with surprising strength, jerked her head toward the door. This way. Lydia followed her into the house, into her new life, her purchased future, her bargain with necessity. The door closed behind them, shutting out the golden afternoon light, and Lydia Hale, who had left Missouri as one person, began the slow transformation into whoever she would need to become to survive this. The spare room was smaller than Lydia had expected, tucked at the end of the upstairs hallway with a single window overlooking the western pastures. Emma deposited the trunk at the foot of the narrow bed with more force than necessary, the thud echoing in the bare space. There's a wash basin on the stand, Emma said without looking at Lydia. Water pitcher's empty. You'll have to get it from the pump yourself. We don't have servants here. I wasn't expecting any, Lydia replied quietly. Emma's shoulders tensed. For a moment, she seemed about to say something else, but instead she turned and walked out, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. The door didn't quite slam, but it closed with enough emphasis to make the point. Lydia stood alone in the room that would be hers. A bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, a wooden chair. Nothing on the walls. No rug on the floor, functional and cold like the greeting she'd received. She moved to the window, looked out at land that stretched endlessly toward mountains she couldn't name. The sun was lowering, painting everything gold and amber. Beautiful and completely foreign. She pressed her forehead against the glass, allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of weakness. Her throat ached with unshed tears, her chest tight with loneliness so vast it felt like drowning. Then she straightened, smoothed her skirts, and got to work. The house needed her whether the people in it knew it yet or not. Downstairs, she found the kitchen in a state that made her hands itch to start cleaning. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the dry sink. The floor needed sweeping. The stove showed evidence of meals cooked by someone who knew how to manage heat, but not how to clean up afterward. A pot sat on the counter with the remnants of what might have been breakfast porridge, now congealed and attracting flies. Emma sat at the large wooden table with Clara, helping the younger girl with what looked like mending. Ben was nowhere to be seen. James played quietly in the corner with wooden blocks, and Alice sat on the floor near the stove, humming tunelessly to a rag doll. The 3 females looked up when Lydia entered. James kept playing, and Alice ignored her completely. I thought I'd start supper, Lydia said. If you could show me where things are kept? Emma's jaw set in that stubborn line Lydia was already beginning to recognize. We usually just have bread and whatever's left from earlier. Then maybe we could have something more tonight, Lydia suggested gently. There are supplies? Root cellars through that door, Emma said shortly, jerking her head toward a corner door. Pantry's there. Do what you want. It wasn't permission exactly, but it wasn't refusal either. Lydia took it. The root cellar was well stocked. Potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, shelves of preserved vegetables and fruits. The pantry held flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, lard, dried beans. Whoever managed supplies knew what they were doing. Probably Caleb himself, Lydia guessed. Or maybe Emma had taken over more responsibility than a 13-year-old should carry. She gathered ingredients, brought them up to the kitchen, began washing vegetables at the pump outside. The water was cold and sweet, the evening air already cooling as the sun dropped lower. She could hear cattle lowing in distant pastures, the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood, the creak of the windmill turning slowly. When she came back inside, Clara had abandoned her mending and was watching Lydia with undisguised curiosity. "What are you making?" the 8-year-old asked. "Vegetable soup," Lydia replied, setting a large pot on the stove, "with dumplings, if the flour's suitable." "Mama used to make dumplings," Claire said softly. Then her eyes widened as if she'd said something forbidden. Emma's head snapped up. "Clara, it's all right," Lydia said quickly. "Of course your mother made dumplings. I'm sure she made them better than I will. I'm not trying to replace her, Clara. I'm just trying to make sure everyone has a decent supper." The tension in the room shifted slightly. Emma's expression remained guarded, but some of the hostility eased. Clara nodded slowly. "Can I help?" the girl asked. "I'd appreciate that," Lydia said. "Could you peel these potatoes?" Clara came to the counter, accepted the knife and bowl Lydia handed her, began working with careful concentration. They worked side by side in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of knife against potato, the crackle of the fire Lydia had built in the stove, James's quiet play in the corner. "How old are you?" Clara asked suddenly. 19. Clara processed this. "That's not very old." "Old enough," Lydia said. "Emma's 13. She says she's practically grown." Lydia glanced at Emma, who was determinedly focused on her mending. 13 is young to carry as much responsibility as she's been carrying. "She takes care of us," Clara said with simple pride, "since Mama died. She cooks and cleans and makes sure James doesn't get into trouble and watches Alice. Papa's always working. Emma does everything else." "That's a heavy load," Lydia said quietly, meaning it. Clara nodded. "Sometimes she cries at night, in her room. She thinks we don't hear, but I do. I share a room with her." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "I'm going to check on the chickens," she announced to no one in particular, and fled through the back door. Clara looked stricken. "I wasn't supposed to say that." "It's all right," Lydia assured her. "Sometimes we need to talk about things, even when they're hard." "Are you going to make Emma stop taking care of us?" Clara asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart. I'm going to help Emma, so she doesn't have to do everything alone anymore." Clara seemed to consider this. "Okay," she said finally, and returned to peeling potatoes. By the time Caleb came in from whatever work had occupied him, full dark had fallen and the kitchen was transformed. The dishes were clean, the floor swept, the table set with mismatched but serviceable plates. The soup pot bubbled on the stove, filling the house with the scent of vegetables and herbs. A plate of sliced bread sat ready, and Lydia was just lifting golden dumplings from the pot. Caleb stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. His children were gathered around the table. Even Emma had returned, though she'd positioned herself at the far end. Ben had appeared from wherever he'd been hiding, drawn by the smell of food. James sat on a wooden crate that boosted him high enough to reach the table. Alice was in a high chair, banging a spoon with enthusiasm. "Supper's ready," Lydia said simply. "If you'd like to wash up." Caleb's expression was unreadable. He nodded slowly, moved to the basin, scrubbed his hands and face. When he took his seat at the head of the table, there was a moment of awkward silence. "I usually say grace," he said gruffly. "Of course," Lydia replied. They bowed their heads. Caleb's prayer was brief and practical, thanking the Lord for the food and the hands that prepared it, asking for strength for the work ahead. When he finished, Lydia began serving, ladling soup into bowls, adding dumplings, passing the bread. The children ate with the focused intensity of people who were genuinely hungry. Even Emma, despite her continued reserve, cleaned her bowl and accepted seconds. James got soup on his shirt and his face and the table, but nobody scolded him. Alice gummed a dumpling into submission, looking pleased with herself. "This is good," Ben said suddenly, surprising everyone, including himself. He ducked his head, embarrassed. "Thank you, Ben," Lydia said. "Real good," Clara added loyally. Caleb ate methodically, saying nothing, but Lydia noticed he took 3 helpings. When the meal was finished, the children began to scatter, but Caleb's voice stopped them. "Dishes," he said simply. Emma stood immediately, began clearing plates. Clara joined her. Ben looked like he might protest, then thought better of it and gathered the bread plate and butter dish. Even James carried his own bowl to the sink, though he had to stretch to reach it. Lydia moved to help, but Emma blocked her path to the sink. "We do our own cleaning," she said, not quite rudely but firmly. "All right," Lydia said. She could choose her battles. This wasn't one worth fighting tonight. Caleb had retreated to a chair near the fireplace with a newspaper that looked several weeks old. Lydia sat at the now-cleared table, watching the children work with the efficiency of long practice. They had a system. Emma washed, Clara dried, Ben put away, James supposedly swept, but mostly pushed crumbs around. Alice had been released from her high chair and was toddling around, getting underfoot and being gently redirected by whoever was nearest. When the kitchen was clean, Caleb looked up from his paper. "Bedtime," he announced. "I'm not tired," Ben protested. "Bed anyway. Sun's up early tomorrow, and there's work to do." The children began their evening routines. Emma took Alice upstairs. Clara followed. James lingered, looking between his father and Lydia with uncertainty. "Go on," Caleb said, his voice softening slightly. "I'll be up to check on you in a minute." James nodded, scampered toward the stairs, then stopped. He looked at Lydia. "Are you staying?" The question hung in the air, loaded with more meaning than a 5-year-old probably intended. "Yes," Lydia said gently. "I'm staying." He seemed to process this, then nodded and disappeared upstairs. Silence settled over the kitchen. Caleb folded his newspaper, set it aside. Lydia remained at the table, unsure what was expected now. "The ceremony's tomorrow," Caleb said abruptly. "Pastor Green will come out in the afternoon. It'll be brief, just the necessary words." Tomorrow. Lydia's stomach tightened. Of course it would be tomorrow. Why wait? The contract was signed, the money paid, the arrangement made. The ceremony was just a formality. "All right," she managed. "I've put your name on the bank account. You'll need access to household funds. There's a monthly allowance for supplies. Emma can show you how we manage the ledgers." He was talking about logistics, practical matters, anything but the fact that tomorrow they would speak vows that bound them legally, if not emotionally. "The children," he continued, staring at the cold fireplace rather than at her. "They're struggling. You saw that. Emma's angry all the time. Ben's withdrawn. Clara's clingy. James has nightmares. Alice doesn't remember her mother, but she feels the loss anyway. The absence." He paused. "I don't know how to fix it. I work. That's what I know. I provide. But the rest—" He made a frustrated gesture. "Mary handled all that. The emotions and the comfort and the knowing what to say. I'm no good at it." "You love them," Lydia said quietly. "That's not nothing. Love doesn't put food on the table or keep the ranch running or teach them what they need to know to survive out here." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Love's a luxury, Miss Hale. Same as you said earlier. We can't afford luxuries." Lydia thought about her mother's words before she left Missouri, about how she should have married for love. She thought about the contract in her trunk upstairs, the legal language that reduced marriage to terms and conditions. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Specifically, beyond keeping house and minding the children. Caleb finally looked at her directly. In the lamplight, his face was all hard angles and shadows, carved by work and grief and the relentless demands of frontier life. "I need you to not expect things I can't give," he said bluntly. "I need you to understand that this is a business arrangement and nothing more. I need you to care for my children without trying to replace their mother. And I need you to not complain about the isolation or the work or the fact that this isn't what you probably dreamed your life would be." "I can do all that," Lydia said steadily. "Can you do something for me?" He looked surprised. "What? Don't treat me like I'm invisible. I know I'm here because you paid for me. I know this isn't a real marriage. But I'm a person, Mr. Rowan, not just a hired hand who happens to share your name. I'll work hard. I'll care for your children. I'll ask nothing from you that wasn't in the contract, but I won't be treated like furniture either." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise again, maybe, or the ghost of respect. "Fair enough," he said after a long moment. "Caleb?" "What?" "Call me Caleb. If we're going to be married, even in name only, Mr. Rowan seems excessive." "All right, Caleb." The name felt strange in her mouth. "And you should call me Lydia." He nodded. Then he stood, clearly ready to end the conversation. I'll show you the rest of the house in the morning. For tonight, you should rest. Tomorrow will be long." He left her sitting at the table, his boots heavy on the stairs. Lydia heard him moving around upstairs, heard the low murmur of his voice as he checked on the children, heard doors closing one by one as the house settled into sleep. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, watching the lamp burn lower, listening to the night sounds of a ranch she didn't know, trying to imagine a future in this place. Tomorrow she would marry a stranger who didn't want a wife. She would become stepmother to 5 grieving children who didn't want a replacement for the mother they'd lost. She would tie herself legally to a life she'd never chosen, in a place that felt as foreign as the moon. But she would survive it. She'd survived her father's death, her family's poverty, the humiliation of being sold to settle debts. She would survive this too. She had to. The alternative was unthinkable. Finally, Lydia climbed the stairs to her small room. She unpacked her trunk by lamplight, hanging her 2 dresses in the empty wardrobe, placing her few possessions on the washstand and the small shelf above it. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, washed her face in the cold water she'd carried up earlier. Before getting into bed, she took out the wooden box containing her grandmother's ring. She opened it, looked at the simple gold band worn smooth by years of wear. Her grandmother had been married for 47 years before death separated her from her husband. They'd been poor, worked hard, raised 6 children in a 2-room cabin, but they'd loved each other. Lydia's mother had told her stories about how they'd looked at each other even in old age, how they'd made each other laugh, how they'd faced hardship together with the strength that came from partnership. That was what marriage was supposed to be. Lydia closed the box, put it away. That kind of marriage wasn't what she was getting tomorrow, but maybe if she was very careful and very strong, she could build something that at least resembled a life worth living. She climbed into bed, pulled the thin quilt up to her chin. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. Somewhere far to the east, her mother and siblings were sleeping in the house that had been saved by Lydia's sacrifice. They were safe because she was here. That had to be enough. It had to be. She closed her eyes and willed herself towards sleep. Morning came too soon and too bright. Lydia woke to unfamiliar sounds, roosters crowing, cattle lowing, the distant ring of metal on metal from the blacksmith shop, or maybe from work on the ranch. Sunlight streamed through her window, promising another hot day. She dressed in her other new dress, the gray cotton one that seemed appropriate for a wedding that wasn't really a wedding. She braided her hair, pinned it up, looked at herself in the small mirror, and saw a stranger looking back. Someone harder than the girl who'd left Missouri 6 days ago. Downstairs, the kitchen was already occupied. Emma had porridge going on the stove, Clara was setting the table, Ben was nowhere to be seen, James sat on his crate working on a bowl of mush, and Alice was in her high chair, painting her face with what looked like oatmeal. "Good morning," Lydia offered. "Morning," Clara responded. Emma just nodded. "Can I help with anything?" "We've got it," Emma said shortly. Lydia poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, took it to the table. The porridge was serviceable but bland, needing salt or sugar or something to give it flavor. She ate without comment, grateful for anything to fill her nervous stomach. Caleb came in smelling like horses and leather, nodded to everyone, served himself, ate standing at the counter. He looked like he'd already been working for hours, which he probably had. Ranch work didn't stop for weddings, even wedding days. "Pastor's coming at 2, he said to the room at large. "Emma, make sure everyone's presentable. Lydia," he paused, seemed unsure what to say. "Be ready, I guess." "I will be," she replied quietly. He nodded again, set down his empty bowl, and left. Through the window, Lydia watched him stride toward the barn, his shoulders set in that perpetual tension she was beginning to recognize as his default state. The morning passed in strange suspension. Lydia helped with washing. There were sheets that needed attention, clothes that needed mending. Emma allowed her to help this time. Maybe because the work was too much for one person. Maybe because something had shifted slightly in the night. "You don't have to do this, you know," Emma said suddenly, her hands deep in soapy water. Lydia looked up from the shirt she was scrubbing. "Do what?" "Marry him. You could leave. Go back to wherever you came from." "Missouri." "And no, I can't." "Why not?" Lydia considered lying, softening the truth. But Emma was 13, nearly grown, carrying adult responsibilities. She deserved honesty. Because my family needed the money your father paid. Because without it, we would have lost everything. Because sometimes we don't get to choose what we want. We only get to choose how we handle what we're given. Emma was quiet for a long moment, scrubbing at a stubborn stain. That's not fair, she said finally. No, Lydia agreed. It's not. But it's true anyway. Do you even like him, my father? I don't know him well enough to like or dislike him. Then how can you marry him? Lydia wrung out the shirt, added it to the rinse bucket. The same way you've been running this household for 2 years despite being a child. Because it's necessary. Because someone has to do it. Because the alternative is worse. Emma's jaw worked like she was trying not to cry. I hate that you're right, she whispered. I know, Lydia said softly. I hate it too. They finished the washing in silence, but it felt different now, less hostile, more like the silence of two people who understood each other's burdens, even if they didn't share them. At 1:30, Lydia went upstairs to prepare. She changed into the brown dress she'd worn the day she arrived, the one with the ivory buttons. She rebraided her hair, twisted it into a more elaborate coil. She had no jewelry except her grandmother's ring, which she slipped onto her right hand for now. At 5 minutes before 2, Pastor Green arrived in a dusty buggy. He was an older man, thin and weathered, with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly with age or maybe with palsy. Caleb met him on the porch, shook his hand, spoke words Lydia couldn't hear through the window. Then Caleb came inside. It's time, he said simply. The children gathered in the parlor, a room Lydia hadn't really seen yet, furnished sparsely with a settee, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace. Emma held Alice on her hip. Clara stood close to Ben. James pressed against Emma's leg. They looked like they were attending a funeral, not a wedding. Maybe it amounted to the same thing. Pastor Green entered, Bible in hand. He smiled at the children, nodded to Lydia, positioned himself in front of the fireplace. Shall we begin? He asked gently. Caleb stood to Lydia's right, maintaining a careful distance. She could smell soap and clean cotton. He'd washed and changed into what must be his Sunday clothes. Neither of them looked at the other. The pastor opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Lydia like water. She heard them without processing them, spoke her vows when prompted. Simple words, promises of faithfulness and partnership that felt hollow in the context of what this actually was. Caleb's voice was steady and emotionless when he spoke his own vows. The ring, Pastor Green asked. Caleb produced a simple gold band from his pocket. Lydia recognized it, his late wife's ring, most likely. He'd probably worn it on a chain or kept it tucked away somewhere safe. Now he was giving it to another woman because that was what the ceremony required. He took Lydia's left hand, his first time actually touching her since helping her into the wagon yesterday, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which somehow made everything worse. This ring had been chosen for someone else, worn by someone else, meant something real to someone else. Now it was Lydia's, a borrowed symbol for a borrowed life. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Green said. He smiled. You may kiss the bride. Caleb went completely still. Lydia's breath caught. They hadn't discussed this part, this expected conclusion to the ceremony. The silence stretched too long. Clara giggled nervously. Emma's expression turned knowing and slightly vindictive. Finally, Caleb leaned in, pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Lydia's cheek. His lips were warm and rough and gone almost before she registered the contact. Congratulations, Pastor Green said, apparently satisfied with this minimal display. May your union be blessed with peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity, not love, not happiness, just the practical blessings suited to a practical arrangement. Caleb shook the pastor's hand, walked him back to his buggy. Through the window, Lydia saw money exchange hands, payment for services rendered. The pastor drove away, leaving dust and silence in his wake. And just like that, Lydia Hale ceased to exist. She was Lydia Rowan now, married woman, stepmother to 5, bound by law and necessity to a man who needed her services, but not her heart. The children dispersed quickly once the pastor left, escaping the awkward weight of what had just happened. Caleb disappeared back to his work. Lydia stood alone in the parlor, looking at the ring on her finger, trying to feel something other than numb. She was married. She was a wife. She was trapped. No, not trapped, committed. There was a difference, however slight. She touched the ring, turned it slowly on her finger. Somewhere in Missouri, her mother and siblings were safe because of this ring, this ceremony, this sacrifice. That had to mean something. It had to be worth something. Even if right now, standing alone in a stranger's parlor in a territory she didn't know, married to a man who looked at her like an employee rather than a partner, it felt like she'd sold more than her future. It felt like she'd sold her soul. But there was no time for self-pity or second thoughts. The afternoon stretched ahead with work that needed doing, children who needed tending, a household that wouldn't run itself regardless of the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. Lydia found Emma in the kitchen, scrubbing the already clean table with unnecessary vigor. The girl's shoulders were rigid, her movement sharp with barely contained emotion. "Emma," Lydia said quietly. "Don't." Emma didn't look up. "Just don't, all right? Don't try to make this something it's not. Don't pretend you're our mother now just because you signed some papers and put on a ring." The words stung despite Lydia having expected them. "I wasn't going to say that." "Then what?" Emma finally looked up, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something fiercer, anger maybe, or fear. "What could you possibly say that would make any of this better?" Lydia pulled out a chair, sat down at the table Emma was attacking. "I was going to ask if you'd show me how you manage the household accounts. Your father mentioned there are ledgers." Emma blinked, clearly thrown by the practical request. "What?" "The ledgers. For household expenses, supply orders, whatever system you've been using. I need to learn it if I'm going to be useful here." "You really want to talk about ledgers? Right now?" "What else should we talk about?" Lydia met the girl's eyes steadily. "I can't change what just happened. I can't make you accept me or like me or want me here. But I can learn how things work so I don't make everything harder than it already is." Emma stared at her for a long moment, the scrub brush dripping soapy water onto the floor. Then something in her expression shifted, just slightly. The rigid anger softened into something more complicated, exhaustion maybe, or the kind of wary hope that comes from being disappointed too many times. "The ledgers are in Papa's office," she said finally. "He keeps track of ranch expenses. I manage the household ones separately." She set down the brush, wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll show you." The office was a small room off the main hallway, lined with shelves holding account books, catalogs, correspondence. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface covered with papers, invoices, receipts. Emma pulled a leather-bound ledger from one of the shelves, opened it to reveal columns of neat figures in a young hand that was trying very hard to look adult. "I write down everything we spend," Emma explained, her finger tracing down the entries. "Flour, sugar, fabric, lamp oil, whatever we need from town. Papa gives me money once a month, and I make it stretch. Sometimes the peddler comes through, and I can get things cheaper, so I try to time big purchases for when he's expected." Lydia studied the ledger, impressed despite herself. The entries were meticulous, organized by category, balanced to the penny. This was the work of someone who understood that mistakes had consequences, who knew that running out of flour in February meant going hungry until supply wagons could get through spring mud. "You've been doing this for 2 years?" Lydia asked. "Since Mama died, somebody had to." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but Lydia heard the weight beneath it. He couldn't manage it. He was working all the time, trying to keep the ranch going, and the house stuff just fell apart, so I figured it out. You were 11 years old. Age doesn't matter much when there's work to be done." Emma closed the ledger, looked at Lydia directly. "That's something you'll learn fast out here if you haven't already. Nobody cares how old you are or whether you feel ready. Things need doing. You do them." It was exactly what Lydia had told her mother before leaving Missouri. Hearing it echoed back by a 13-year-old made her chest tight. "Will you teach me your system?" Lydia asked. "I don't want to change what's working. I just want to help carry the load." Emma studied her face, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right, But I'm still keeping my own ledger too. I don't trust easy. Fair enough, Lydia said. I wouldn't either. The rest of the afternoon passed in careful navigation of new routines. Emma showed Lydia where supplies were kept, how much things cost in town versus from the peddler, which merchants extended credit and which demanded cash. Clara drifted in and out, offering shy comments about what she liked to eat or what made Alice fussy. Ben remained scarce, appearing only for the evening meal before disappearing again to whatever refuge he'd found. James shadowed Lydia with the intense curiosity of a 5-year-old trying to understand why his world had shifted again. He asked questions in rapid succession. Where did she come from? Did she have brothers and sisters? Could she make cookies? Did she know any stories? Why were her hands smaller than Papa's? Did she like horses? I don't know much about horses, Lydia admitted, peeling potatoes at the kitchen counter while James sat on his crate nearby. We didn't have any in Missouri. No horses? James looked scandalized. How did you go anywhere? We walked mostly. Sometimes we borrowed a wagon from neighbors. That's sad, James declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Everyone should have horses. Papa says horses are what make Montana different from other places. Horses and big sky and mountains. Your papa's probably right, Lydia said, smiling despite herself. He's always right, James said loyally. Then his face clouded. Except when he said Mama would get better. He was wrong about that. The knife stilled in Lydia's hand. She looked at the small boy, saw grief etched into features too young to carry it. I'm sorry you lost your mama, she said quietly. That must have been very hard. She got sick and then she died, James said with the blunt simplicity children used for unbearable things. Papa said she went to heaven, but I don't know where that is, and she never came back. He swung his legs against the crate. Are you going to die too? The question punched the air from Lydia's lungs. No, sweetheart. I mean, everyone dies eventually, but I'm healthy and I plan to be here for a very long time. Mama was healthy too. Then she wasn't. James looked at her with eyes far too old for his face. Nothing stays. Before Lydia could figure out how to respond to that devastating observation, Alice toddled over, her rag doll dangling from one hand. She looked up at Lydia with dark eyes that held none of her brother's wariness, just simple 3-year-old assessment. Up? Alice demanded, raising her free arm. Lydia set down the knife, wiped her hands, bent to pick up the little girl. Alice settled on her hip with the comfortable weight of a child who didn't yet understand complicated emotions like loyalty or betrayal. She just knew this new person was here and had arms for holding. Dolly, Alice announced, shoving the rag doll in Lydia's face. She's very pretty, Lydia said. Her name is Dolly, Alice said, as if this was obvious. Of course it is. Hello, Dolly. Alice giggled, pressed her face against Lydia's shoulder, then immediately squirmed to get down. She toddled away, onto the next thing, already forgetting the interaction. But James watched from his crate, his expression unreadable. She doesn't remember Mama, he said quietly. She was only 1 when Mama died. Emma says Alice thinks Mama is just a word, not a person. Do you remember her? Lydia asked gently. Some things. She smelled like bread, and she sang when she did laundry, and she used to tell me stories about a brave knight and a dragon. His voice got very small. I'm starting to forget her face. Emma says that's normal, but it feels wrong. Lydia's heart cracked for this child trying to hold on to fragments of memory while the world demanded he keep moving forward. Maybe Emma could tell you stories about your mama, she suggested, things she remembers. That way you'd have her words even if the pictures get fuzzy. James considered this. Maybe, he said. Then, can you tell stories? Some, Lydia admitted. Good ones? I suppose that depends on what you think makes a story good. Fighting, James said immediately, and horses, and maybe a treasure. Lydia laughed, surprising herself. I'll see what I can do. When Caleb came in for supper, he found the kitchen warm and filled with the scent of roasted chicken, the table set, the children already gathering. His eyes went to Lydia, who stood at the stove with Alice on her hip, and James hanging on her skirt, then to Emma, who was slicing bread with slightly less aggressive force than usual. Smells good, he offered gruffly. There's plenty, Lydia replied evenly, Though we'll need to discuss the chicken situation. The coop needs repairs, and I think we're losing eggs to a predator. Caleb blinked, clearly not expecting practical observation on her first full day. I'll check it tomorrow. They ate in relative quiet, the children focused on food, the adults navigating the strange new dynamic of shared space and separate lives. Clara tried to fill the silence with chatter about the garden, how the tomatoes were coming in, how the beans needed picking. Ben said nothing but ate 3 helpings. Emma maintained her careful distance, watchful and evaluating. After the meal, after the dishes, after the children were herded toward bed with varying degrees of protest, Lydia found herself alone in the kitchen again. The house settled around her with creaks and sighs, unfamiliar sounds that would become familiar with time. She heated water for washing, scrubbed her face and hands, tried not to think about the fact that this was her wedding night, and she was spending it alone in the kitchen of a man who'd made it clear he wanted nothing from her beyond labor. Footsteps on the stairs made her look up. Caleb appeared, hesitated in the doorway. I wanted to say... He stopped, started again. The children seemed settled, more than I expected. It's early yet, Lydia said carefully. They're just figuring out where I fit. Emma showed you the ledgers? She did. Your daughter is remarkably capable. Something complicated crossed Caleb's face. She's had to be. I wasn't... After Mary died, I couldn't... He made a frustrated sound. I failed them. My children. I let Emma carry too much because I couldn't bear to be in this house, couldn't stand the constant reminders. So I worked. From dawn until dark, I worked. And I let a child run my household because I was too much of a coward to face what we'd lost. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Lydia saw him clearly for the first time. Not just a stern rancher or a man who'd purchased a solution to his problems, but a father drowning in grief and guilt, doing the only thing he knew how to do. You kept the ranch running, she said quietly. You kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. That's not nothing, Caleb. It's not enough either. His hands fisted at his sides. Emma cries at night. Ben won't talk to me. Clara's terrified of being left alone. James has nightmares, and Alice... His voice broke slightly. Alice will never know her mother. That's my fault. If I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd... Stop. Lydia's voice was sharper than she intended. You can't change what happened. You can only work with what is. That's easier said than done. Nothing about any of this is easy. Lydia crossed her arms, met his eyes directly. But here's what I know. Your children need you present, not perfect. They need you to show up, to talk to them, to acknowledge that they're struggling instead of pretending work solves everything. What do you know about it? The question wasn't hostile, just genuinely curious. You're 19. You've never had children. You've been here one day. I know what it's like to lose a parent, Lydia said steadily. I know what it feels like when the surviving parent is so buried in their own grief they can't see yours. I know that children need honesty more than they need protection from hard truths. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Your father, he said finally. That's why you're here. That's the debt you mentioned. He died owing more than we could pay. This was the only way to keep my family intact. She touched the ring on her finger, Mary's ring, now hers. So yes, I know something about sacrifice and hard choices and doing what has to be done even when it tears you apart. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to make that choice. Are you sorry you benefited from it? Lydia asked, not accusing, just curious. He considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. I needed help. You provided it. That's the agreement. But I can be sorry for the circumstances that forced your hand while still being grateful you're here. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. Lydia nodded slowly. Fair enough? Silence settled again, but it felt different now. Less hostile, more like the beginning of understanding between two people trapped in the same complicated situation. I should let you rest, Caleb said. Tomorrow's another long day. Caleb, Lydia stopped him before he could leave. Your children are watching to see if you mean it. About me being here. About things being different. Emma especially. She's testing whether you'll actually let me help or if this is just another thing that will fall apart and leave her holding the pieces. His jaw tightened. What should I do? Show up, Lydia said simply. At meals, in the evenings, when they need you. Stop hiding in work and be their father, not just their provider. He nodded slowly, then left without another word. Lydia heard his boots on the stairs, heard his door close. The house fell silent except for the usual night sounds, wind against windows, the distant call of a nightbird, the creak of wood settling. She climbed the stairs to her small room, changed into her nightgown, lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, Caleb was doing the same in the room he'd shared with his first wife. Between them, 5 children slept or didn't sleep, processing in their own ways the reality of this stranger who'd invaded their world. And Lydia wondered, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, if she had the strength to do what she'd promised, to care for children who didn't want her care, to build something functional, if not warm, in the space between necessity and resentment, to survive in a place where survival seemed to be the highest aspiration anyone could manage. Sleep came eventually, restless and filled with fragmented dreams of Missouri and Montana tangled together until she couldn't tell which was home and which was exile. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both routine and exhausting. Lydia rose before dawn, started the stove, made coffee and breakfast. The children appeared one by one. Emma first, always, taking her role as oldest seriously. Then Clara, then Ben, then James. Alice slept latest, requiring coaxing and patience to fully wake. Caleb was always already gone, out to the barns or the fields or wherever ranch work demanded his presence. He returned for meals, ate efficiently, spoke little, but Lydia noticed small changes. He lingered at breakfast instead of bolting his food. He asked the children about their days. He stayed in the kitchen after supper, ostensibly reading his newspaper but really just being present. Emma noticed too. Lydia caught the girl watching her father with something like cautious hope, as if she was afraid to believe the change would last. The household work was relentless. Laundry for 7 people meant hours at the washboard, arms aching, hands raw. Cooking required planning and creativity with limited ingredients. The garden demanded daily attention. The chickens needed feeding and eggs collecting. The house needed sweeping, dusting, scrubbing. And woven through it all, the constant needs of children, questions answered, tears dried, quarrels mediated, fears soothed. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, things shifted. Clara began seeking Lydia out, chattering about everything and nothing, clearly starved for adult attention that wasn't burdened by the weight Emma carried. James started bringing her small treasures, interesting rocks, wildflowers, a bird's feather, offerings that seemed to mean she was being accepted into his world. Even Alice began to recognize Lydia's voice, toddling over when called, allowing herself to be comforted after falls or frights. Ben remained distant, watching from the margins, participating minimally. And Emma maintained her careful reserve, helpful but never warm, cooperative but never trusting. Lydia didn't push. She simply showed up, day after day, doing the work that needed doing, being the steady presence the household had lacked. 3 weeks into her marriage, Lydia was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard shouting from the barn. She straightened, hands muddy, heart suddenly racing. The voices were male, Caleb's and someone else's, raised in argument. She dropped her trowel, hurried toward the barn. As she got closer, she could make out words. "Told you last month, Caleb. I can't keep extending credit forever. And I told you the cattle sale is next week. You'll get your money then." "That's what you said last time, and the time before that." Lydia reached the barn entrance, saw Caleb facing off with a heavy-set man in town clothes, Mr. Thornton from the general store, she guessed, or maybe the feed supplier. Both men's faces were flushed with anger and frustration. "I've never failed to pay what I owe," Caleb said, his voice tight. "No, but you're cutting it closer every time. This operation is barely holding together, and everyone in town knows it." The man's eyes flicked to Lydia, registered her presence with poorly concealed interest. "Ah, the new wife. Heard you'd married. Hope she came with money because you're going to need it." Caleb's expression went dangerously cold. "Watch yourself, Thornton." I'm just stating facts. This ranch has been struggling since Mary died. You're spread too thin, can't manage the work, can't manage the house, can't manage those kids of yours. Bringing in some girl from back east isn't going to fix what's fundamentally broken. Get off my land, Caleb said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. I'll go. But Caleb, seriously, you need to make some hard decisions. Sell off some acreage, reduce the herd, something. You can't keep running on hope and borrowed time. Thornton left, his wagon rattling down the drive. Caleb stood rigid, staring after him, hands clenched into fists. Lydia approached cautiously. Caleb, don't. He didn't look at her. Just don't. Is it true? What he said about the ranch? Doesn't matter if it's true. Caleb finally turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of worries she hadn't fully understood. I'll handle it. How? Lydia asked quietly. If you're already stretched thin, if the ranch is barely holding together, how are you going to handle it alone? The same way I've handled everything else. By working harder. That's not a solution, that's just stubbornness. The words came out sharper than Lydia intended, but she was tired too, tired of everyone pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. You can't work 25 hours in a day. You can't be in 3 places at once, and you can't keep carrying everything yourself just because you're too proud to ask for help. What would you know about it? Caleb snapped. You've been here 3 weeks. You don't understand how ranching works, what it takes, what's at stake. I know enough to see that you're drowning and refusing to reach for anything that might keep you afloat. Lydia crossed her arms. I also know that you have 5 children depending on you, and if this ranch fails, where does that leave them? The question hit its mark. Caleb's expression crumpled slightly before he got it under control. It won't fail. I won't let it. Wanting something doesn't make it true. Lydia softened her tone. Talk to me. What's the real situation? For a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then his shoulders sagged just slightly and he gestured toward the barn. Come on, I'll show you. Inside the barn, he pulled out a leather satchel from a locked trunk, extracted papers and ledgers. Spread across a rough workbench, they told a story of slow decline, debts mounting, income falling short, assets slowly liquidating to cover gaps. Mary's medical bills, Caleb said, pointing to one column of numbers, wiped out our savings. Then the following winter was brutal. Lost 30 head of cattle to cold and hunger. Had to buy feed to keep the rest alive. Then last spring, the creek flooded, took out fences, destroyed half the hay barn. Insurance didn't cover enough. So I've been borrowing to keep going, hoping each season would be the one that put us back in the black. But it hasn't, Lydia said quietly. No, it hasn't. He rubbed his face with both hands. Thornton's right. I'm barely holding on. Another bad season, another disaster, and we're done. Why didn't you say something before? When you were arranging the marriage, why not mention the ranch was in trouble? Caleb looked at her directly. Would you have come if you'd known? Lydia thought about it honestly. Yes. My situation was desperate enough that yours wouldn't have changed the equation. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. But I needed help with the children and the house. I didn't want you thinking you'd have to save the ranch too. And yet here we are, Lydia said. She studied the ledgers, the stark reality of numbers that didn't lie. How much do you need to get stable again? More than I have. More than I can earn in 1 season, maybe 2. He gathered the papers, as if hiding the evidence would make the problem smaller. But I'll figure it out. I always do. Lydia left him in the barn, her mind churning with numbers and possibilities, and the sinking realization that she'd walked into more than she'd bargained for. The children weren't the only thing broken here. The entire foundation was cracking, and everyone was pretending not to notice the sound of things falling apart. That evening, she watched the children at supper, saw their easy assumption that tomorrow would be like today, that the ranch would always be here, that their world was stable even if their hearts weren't. She saw Emma's fierce competence masking terror of more loss. She saw Ben's withdrawal as protection against caring too much. She saw Clara's need for reassurance, James's fear of impermanence, Alice's innocent ignorance of how fragile everything actually was. And she understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't just about keeping house or caring for children or fulfilling a contract. This was about survival, all of theirs, together. After the children were in bed, Lydia found Caleb in his office, staring at the same ledgers she'd seen earlier. "I want to see the full accounting," she said without preamble. "Everything, income, expenses, debts, assets, all of it." He looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because I'm your wife, even if only on paper. Because what threatens this ranch threatens those children. And because two people looking at a problem see more than one person staring at it alone." "You don't know anything about ranching." "No," Lydia agreed, "but I know about managing on nothing. I know about making hard choices and stretching resources and finding solutions when there don't seem to be any." She pulled up a chair, sat across from him. "Show me the books, Caleb. Let me help." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then he pushed the ledgers across the desk. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what we can figure out." They worked late into the night, lamplight casting long shadows across the cluttered desk while moths battered against the window glass. Lydia's head ached from squinting at cramped figures. Her back protested from hours bent over ledgers. But she pushed through the discomfort, driven by the grim understanding that numbers didn't negotiate or offer mercy. The picture that emerged was worse than Caleb had initially suggested. The ranch owed money to the feed supplier, the bank, the general store, the blacksmith, even the doctor who'd failed to save Mary. Each debt had seemed manageable alone, Lydia supposed, but stacked together they formed a weight that would crush anyone who tried to carry it. "Here," Lydia said, pointing to an entry from 6 months prior. "You sold 20 head of cattle but only recorded payment for 15. What happened to the other 5? Caleb leaned over to look, his shoulder brushing hers in the cramped space. "Paid directly to the feed supplier, barter instead of cash. Thornton accepted it to reduce what I owed him." "But you didn't adjust the debt column to reflect that payment." "Didn't I?" Caleb frowned, pulled the feed supplier's ledger closer. "Hell, you're right. That's $200 I've been counting as owed when it's already settled." It was a small victory, but Lydia felt a flicker of something like hope. She made a notation, moved to the next discrepancy. By midnight, they'd found 3 more errors. Nothing dramatic, but together they reduced Caleb's perceived debt by nearly $400. "It's still not enough," Caleb said, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Even with these corrections, I'm barely treading water." "No, but it's a start," Lydia countered. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, began writing. "What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to pay everything at once, what if we prioritized? The bank gets paid first because they can foreclose. The feed supplier gets paid next because you can't run cattle without feed. The general store can wait. They won't refuse to serve you over a few months' delay, not when half the town probably owes them money. Thornton already threatened to cut off credit. Thornton threatens everyone. It's how he negotiates." Lydia had known men like Thornton in Missouri, men who wielded debt like a weapon. "But he's also a businessman. He knows if he forces you under, he gets nothing. Better to wait and collect eventually than to destroy his debtor and guarantee loss." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight, something like surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "Where did you learn to think like this?" "Poverty's a good teacher," Lydia said simply. "When you're choosing between eating and keeping the roof over your head, you learn real fast how to negotiate with people who have power over you." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, show me what you're thinking." They worked until the lamp oil ran low, and exhaustion made the numbers swim on the page. Lydia created a payment schedule that prioritized survival over pride, that bought time instead of demanding impossible immediate solutions. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a plan, and a plan was better than drowning in panic. "This could work," Caleb said finally, his voice rough with fatigue. "It's tight, requires everything to go right, but it could work." "Nothing ever goes completely right," Lydia cautioned. "So we build in margins. We assume something will fail and plan for it." "You sound like a general planning a campaign." "Survival is a campaign, the only one that matters." Lydia set down her pencil, flexed her cramped fingers. "We should sleep. Tomorrow we start executing this, and we'll need clear heads." Caleb gathered the ledgers, locked them away. When he turned back, his expression was different, less guarded, more genuine. Thank you. For this, for caring enough to help even though you didn't have to. We're in this together now, whether either of us wanted it or not, Lydia said. Your problems are my problems. Your children's futures depend on this ranch surviving. That makes it my concern. Still, Caleb said quietly, thank you. They climbed the stairs in silence, the house dark and quiet around them. At the top of the landing, where the hallway split toward their separate rooms, Caleb hesitated. Lydia, the children, they're changing around you. Even Emma's softening, though she'd never admit it. You're doing more than I had any right to expect. I'm doing what needs doing, Lydia replied, but something warm unfurled in her chest at the acknowledgement. Same as you, same as we all are. He nodded, started toward his room, then stopped. Mary would have liked you, I think. She had the same kind of steel underneath, the kind that doesn't bend when the wind blows hard. It was the first time he'd spoken his late wife's name directly to Lydia, the first acknowledgement that she was a real person who'd existed and mattered, not just a ghost haunting the edges of their arrangement. Lydia felt the weight of it, the trust implicit in sharing even that small piece of grief. I hope I can live up to that, she said softly. You already are, Caleb said, and disappeared into his room. Lydia lay in bed long after, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the strange shape her life had taken. She'd come here expecting to be a servant in all but name, to trade labor for her family's survival and nothing more. But somehow, imperceptibly, the calculus had shifted. She cared about these children, about their stubborn, withdrawn father, about this struggling ranch in the middle of Montana wilderness. It terrified her, this caring. Caring meant vulnerability. Caring meant the possibility of loss. But apparently her heart hadn't consulted her head about the wisdom of getting invested, because here she was, wide awake and scheming about cattle sales and debt negotiations, worrying about whether James's nightmares would ease and if Emma would ever truly trust her, and how to coax Ben out of his protective silence. Here she was, becoming part of something she'd never planned to be part of. The following weeks were a blur of carefully orchestrated chaos. Lydia accompanied Caleb to town, sat in meetings with creditors, presented their payment plan with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Some accepted readily, grateful for any acknowledgement of debt. Others required persuasion, negotiation, the kind of delicate maneuvering that left Lydia exhausted and buzzing with nervous energy. Thornton was the hardest sell. He sat across from them in his office above the general store, his expression skeptical as Lydia laid out their proposal. You're asking me to wait another 4 months for payment, he said flatly. We're asking you to accept a structured plan that guarantees you'll be paid in full, Lydia corrected, as opposed to forcing foreclosure and recovering maybe 50 cents on the dollar after the bank takes its cut. The bank would pay me before some ranch wife's promises. The bank would pay you what's left after they've taken their share, Lydia said evenly, which, if you've looked at the Rowan Ranch's assessment, you know won't be enough to cover what you're owed. We're offering you full payment plus interest. All we need is time. Thornton's eyes narrowed. You've got a sharp tongue for someone so young. Age has nothing to do with mathematics, Mr. Thornton. The numbers are the numbers. He leaned back, studied her with grudging respect. Caleb, you've got yourself a spitfire here. Maybe she'll keep you afloat after all. He pulled out his ledger. Fine. 4 months. But if you miss even one payment, I call the whole debt due immediately. Understood? Understood, Caleb said. They left with the agreement signed, and Lydia felt her knees go weak with relief once they were out of sight. Caleb caught her elbow, steadying her. You all right? I will be. Once my heart stops racing. She took a shaky breath. I've never negotiated like that before. I was terrified he'd refuse. You didn't look terrified. You looked like you were born doing this. Caleb's hand lingered on her arm for a moment before he dropped it. Where did you learn to talk like that? To hold your ground with men like Thornton? Watching my mother after my father died, Lydia admitted. She had to face down creditors too. Most of them treated her like she was stupid because she was a widow, like grief made her incompetent. She learned fast to speak their language, to meet them on their terms. She smiled wryly. I guess I inherited that particular skill. Remind me never to negotiate against you, Caleb said, and there was something almost like warmth in his voice. Back at the ranch, they found chaos. Emma met them at the door, her face flushed and frustrated. "Ben's missing," she said without preamble. "He left after breakfast and never came back. I've looked everywhere." Caleb's expression went tight. "How long has he been gone?" 3 hours, maybe 4. "Did he take anything? Food? Water?" "I don't think so. His room looks normal." Emma twisted her apron in her hands. "I'm sorry, Papa. I should have been watching closer." "This isn't your fault," Caleb said firmly. "Where have you checked? The barn, the chicken coop, the creek, the tree line to the south. I didn't want to go farther with the little ones here." "You did right." Caleb was already moving, grabbing supplies. "I'll check the north pasture and the old line shack. Lydia, can you search the house top to bottom? Sometimes he hides in strange places." Lydia nodded, already heading inside. She searched methodically, under beds, in closets, behind furniture. She checked the root cellar, the pantry, even the space beneath the porch. No Ben. Clara trailed after her, increasingly worried. "What if he's hurt? What if something got him?" "Your papa will find him," Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. "Ben's smart. He wouldn't go far enough to get into real trouble." But as the afternoon wore on and Caleb returned without Ben, that confidence wavered. Emma took the younger children inside, trying to distract them from the growing tension. Lydia and Caleb regrouped in the kitchen. "He's not in any of the usual places," Caleb said, frustration and fear warring in his expression. "I don't understand why he'd just disappear like this. Has he done it before?" "Not like this. He wanders sometimes, needs space, but he always comes back by supper." Lydia thought about Ben, the quiet boy who observed more than he spoke, who carried grief in a silence that even Emma's sharp tongue couldn't crack. What mattered to him before? Before your wife died? What did Ben care about? Caleb looked confused by the question. Why does that matter?" "Because people run to things they love when they're overwhelmed. They seek comfort in familiar places." Lydia grabbed Caleb's arm. "Think. What did Ben love?" Caleb's face changed as memory surfaced. "The old oak. There's an ancient oak tree about half a mile west, near where the property meets the Carson land. Mary used to take the children there for picnics. Ben loved climbing it, said he could see the whole world from the top branches." They ran, Lydia gathering her skirts to keep pace with Caleb's longer strides. The sun was lowering, painting the sky orange and pink, making the shadows long and deceptive. They crashed through brush and tall grass, following a path that was barely visible, overgrown from disuse. The oak appeared like a monument, massive and gnarled, its branches spreading wide enough to shade a small house. And there, high in those branches, so still Lydia almost missed him, sat Ben. "Ben!" Caleb's voice cracked with relief and residual fear. "Get down here, now!" The boy didn't move, didn't even acknowledge he'd heard. "Ben, please," Caleb tried again. "You scared us. Come down so we can talk." "I don't want to talk," Ben called down, his voice thin and defiant. "I want to be left alone." "Son, don't call me that." Ben's voice broke. "You're not my father anymore. You haven't been since Mama died." The words landed like physical blows. Caleb went white, took a step back as if struck. Lydia touched his arm gently, then looked up at the tree. "Ben," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm coming up. Not to make you come down, just to sit with you. Is that all right?" Silence. Then, grudgingly, "I guess." Lydia hadn't climbed a tree since she was Clara's age, but she found the familiar rhythm of it, testing branches, pulling herself up, ignoring the protest of muscles unused to such work. She climbed until she reached the thick branch where Ben sat, his back against the trunk, his eyes red-rimmed and furious. She settled beside him, careful to give him space, and simply looked out at the view. From this height, the ranch spread below like a patchwork, the house small and vulnerable, the mountains massive on the horizon. The world felt both infinite and contained, beautiful and terrifying. "Your mama brought you here," Lydia said quietly. "Every Sunday in summer," Ben said. "We'd pack food and she'd tell stories and we'd just be. Not working, not worrying, just being together." His voice went thick. Papa hasn't brought us here once since she died. Acts like this place doesn't exist. Acts like she didn't exist. I don't think that's true, Lydia said gently. I think it hurts too much to come here, to remember. Then he's a coward, Ben spat, running from memories because they hurt, leaving us to deal with it alone while he buries himself in work. Emma had to grow up overnight. Clara cries herself to sleep. James thinks everyone he loves will die. And me, I'm just angry all the time and nobody even notices because Papa won't look at me long enough to see. Lydia's heart broke for this 11-year-old boy carrying adult rage and grief with no outlet, no acknowledgement, no help processing the enormity of his loss. You're right to be angry, she said. Ben's head whipped toward her, clearly expecting argument or dismissal. You lost your mother, your father withdrew, your family fell apart. Those are legitimate reasons to be furious. Everyone keeps saying I should forgive him, that he's doing his best. Maybe he is doing his best. Maybe his best still isn't enough. Both things can be true. Lydia looked at him directly. But Ben, hiding in a tree doesn't solve anything. It just delays the conversation that needs to happen. What conversation? He doesn't talk. He just works and expects us to be fine. Then you have to make him talk. You have to say the things that are eating you alive, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it hurts. Lydia took a breath. My father died owing money we couldn't pay. My mother couldn't handle it alone. She sent me here, essentially sold me to your father to clear the debts. I was so angry at her for that. Felt like she chose my siblings over me, like I was expendable. Ben listened, his expression shifting from defiance to reluctant attention. But then I realized something, Lydia continued. My mother made an impossible choice because she had no good options. She did what she thought would save the most people, even though it cost her the daughter she raised. That doesn't mean I'm not still angry sometimes, but I understand it better now. And understanding helps. How do I make him understand? Ben asked, his voice small and lost. You tell him. Exactly what you told me, that you're angry and hurt and you need him to be your father again, not just a man who lives in the same house. Lydia touched his shoulder gently. But you have to come down first. You have to choose to engage instead of hiding. Ben looked down at where Caleb stood, a small figure on the ground, neck craned to watch them. What if he doesn't listen? Then you keep trying until he does. Or until you've said everything you need to say and can find peace whether he hears it or not. Lydia stood carefully on the branch, offered her hand. Come on, let's face this together. Ben stared at her hand for a long moment. Then he took it, let her help him to his feet. They climbed down slowly, carefully, until they reached the ground where Caleb waited, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Ben, Caleb started, but Ben cut him off. No, I need to talk, and you need to listen. The boy's hands were fists at his sides, his whole body rigid with the effort of holding himself together. I'm angry at you, Papa. I'm so angry I can barely breathe sometimes. You left us. Mama died and you just left. Physically you were here, but you weren't really here. You made Emma be the parent. You made us all pretend we were fine when we were falling apart. And you never, not once, asked us if we were okay. Caleb's face crumpled. Ben, I'm not finished. Ben's voice was shaking but determined. I miss Mama every single day. But I miss you too. I miss having a father who sees me, who cares about more than whether the chores got done. I miss the way you used to ruffle my hair when I did good work, the way you'd take me fishing, the way you'd listen when I had something to say. Tears were streaming down his face now. I need you, Papa. We all need you. And you've been so far away for so long that I don't know if you can ever come back. Caleb dropped to his knees, pulled Ben into his arms, held his son, while they both shook with sobs that had been building for 2 years. Lydia stepped back, gave them privacy for this long overdue breaking, this necessary shattering before anything could heal. She watched them through her own tears, this father and son finally reaching for each other across the chasm grief had carved between them. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was broken but clear. I'm sorry. Ben, I'm so sorry. You're right, about all of it. I failed you. I let my grief make me selfish and cowardly, and I left you children to carry burdens you should never have had to carry. He pulled back, looked his son in the eyes. I can't change what I've done, but I can do better going forward. I can show up. I can see you. I can be your father again, not just a man who provides food and shelter. Promise? Ben asked, his voice wavering between hope and fear. I promise, Caleb said firmly. And when I slip, because I will sometimes, you call me on it. You hold me accountable. All right? Ben nodded, collapsed back against his father's chest. They sat that way for a long time, beneath the oak tree where Mary Rowan had brought her children for Sunday picnics, while the sun set and the first stars appeared and the world slowly stopped feeling quite so broken. Eventually they walked back to the house together, Caleb carrying Ben when the boy's legs got tired from emotion and exertion. Emma met them at the door, took one look at her father's face and her brother's tear-stained cheeks, and something in her expression cracked open. Are we... she started, then stopped, unable to finish. We're going to be okay, Caleb said quietly. It's going to take work. It's going to be hard. But we're going to be okay. Emma nodded, turned away quickly to hide her own tears, but not before Lydia saw the desperate relief flooding her young face. That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb found Lydia on the porch, watching the stars spread across the infinite Montana sky. He sat beside her on the steps, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Thank you, he said, for going after Ben, for knowing what to say when I didn't. I just listened, Lydia replied. That's all any of them need. Someone willing to listen without judgment or defensiveness. You're good at that, listening. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I've been so focused on survival that I forgot about living, forgot that my children need more than food and shelter. They need me present, engaged, caring about their hearts as much as their bodies. You're learning, Lydia said gently. That's all any of us can do. I see them changing around you, opening up in ways they haven't since Mary died. You're giving them something I couldn't, stability, attention, someone who shows up consistently. He looked at her, and in the starlight, his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. This arrangement, it was supposed to be practical, business. But you've become more than that, to them, He stopped, seemed to catch himself. To you? Lydia asked quietly. Caleb held her gaze. Yes, to me. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to fully examine. Lydia felt her heart beat faster, felt something shift in the careful distance they'd maintained. I didn't come here expecting that, she said. Any of it. The children's trust, your partnership, this, whatever this is. Neither did I, Caleb admitted, but here we are anyway. Here they were. Two people thrown together by necessity, finding something that looked surprisingly like partnership, possibly like friendship, maybe like the beginnings of something more. It terrified Lydia and thrilled her in equal measure. We should be careful, she said, but she didn't move away. Probably, Caleb agreed, but he didn't move either. They sat that way for a long time, shoulders touching, breathing the same air, watching the same stars, until the cold drove them inside to their separate rooms, their separate beds, their separate thoughts about what was growing between them and whether it was wise to let it continue. But wisdom, Lydia was learning, had little to do with the heart's trajectory. You could plan and prepare and protect all you wanted, but the heart made its own decisions about what mattered and who mattered, and when to risk everything on the possibility that something broken could become something beautiful. She fell asleep that night thinking about Caleb's admission, about the warmth in his voice when he'd said she mattered to him, about the careful way he'd sat beside her as if proximity alone could convey what words couldn't quite capture. And she wondered, with equal parts hope and fear, where this trajectory would lead them all. The weeks following Ben's confrontation beneath the oak tree brought changes that rippled through the household like stones dropped in still water. Caleb began eating breakfast with the family instead of bolting his food before dawn. He lingered after supper, asking about the children's days, actually listening to their answers. He took Ben fishing one Saturday afternoon, just the two of them, and came back with a string of trout and something lighter in his expression than Lydia had seen before. Emma watched these changes with cautious eyes, still testing whether they would last, still protecting herself against disappointment. But slowly, incrementally, her shoulders lost some of their rigid tension. She smiled more. She let Lydia help with the household ledgers without argument, and one evening, when Lydia was tucking Alice into bed, Emma appeared in the doorway. "Can we talk?" the girl asked, her voice uncertain. "Of course." Lydia finished settling Alice, kissed the little girl's forehead, and followed Emma to the porch. They sat on the steps where Lydia and Caleb had sat weeks before. The same stars overhead, the same cool evening air carrying the scent of sage and pine. Emma picked at the hem of her dress, not meeting Lydia's eyes. "I've been unfair to you," Emma said finally, "since you got here. I've been cold and suspicious and difficult." "You've been protecting yourself and your siblings," Lydia corrected gently. "That's not unfair. That's survival." "Still," Emma looked up and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You didn't deserve it. You've been nothing but good to us, and I've treated you like an enemy when really you're—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "You're not trying to replace Mama. I see that now. You're just trying to help, and I'm tired of fighting you." Lydia felt something tight in her chest loosen. "I know I'm not your mother, Emma. I would never presume to be. But I care about you, about all of you, and I want to make this work, whatever shape that takes." "I want that too," Emma whispered. Then, so quietly, Lydia almost missed it, "I'm so tired of carrying everything alone." "You don't have to anymore," Lydia said, and pulled the girl into a hug. Emma stiffened for just a moment, then collapsed against Lydia's shoulder and sobbed. Great heaving cries that shook her whole body, 2 years of fear and exhaustion and desperate loneliness finally finding release. Lydia held her, rocked her, murmured wordless comfort, while Emma broke apart and began, finally, to heal. When the storm passed, Emma pulled back, wiping her face with her apron. "I loved her so much," Emma said raggedly. "Mama, I loved her, and she died anyway, and I couldn't save her, couldn't do anything except watch her slip away. And then Papa fell apart, and somebody had to keep the family together, so it had to be me. But I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't. I'm just 13, and I'm so scared all the time that I'm failing them, that I'm not enough." "You've been more than enough," Lydia said firmly. "You've kept your siblings safe and fed and loved through impossible circumstances. But Emma, you're allowed to just be a child sometimes. You're allowed to not have all the answers. What if I forget how? What if I've been grown up so long I don't remember how to just be young?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Lydia promised. "We'll find space for you to be 13 again, to play and laugh and not carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Emma nodded, exhausted but lighter somehow. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for not expecting me to just accept everything without question, for letting me be angry and scared and difficult until I was ready to stop." "You're welcome," Lydia said softly. "And Emma? You can always come to me, with anything. I may not have all the answers, but I promise I'll always listen." Something shifted between them in that moment, some final wall crumbling. Emma leaned her head against Lydia's shoulder, and they sat together watching the stars, no longer adversaries, not quite mother and daughter, but something real and chosen and precious nonetheless. Inside the house, Caleb stood at the window, watching them. When Lydia came back in after Emma had gone to bed, he was waiting. "She trusts you," he said. "Really trusts you. I heard her crying. That's the first time she's let anyone see her break since Mary died." "She needed to," Lydia said. "She's been holding everything in for too long. Because I made her. Because I was so lost in my own grief I couldn't see hers." Caleb's expression was pained. "I look at my children now and see all the ways I've failed them. Ben's anger, Emma's walls, Clara's fear of abandonment, James's nightmares, all of it traces back to me not being what they needed." "You're being what they need now," Lydia said. "That's what matters. You can't change the past, Caleb. You can only shape what comes next." He moved closer, and Lydia was suddenly very aware of the intimacy of the moment. Late evening, the house quiet around them, just the two of them in the soft lamplight. His eyes searched her face as if looking for something he'd lost and was surprised to find again. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. "Not just for them. For me too. I was barely surviving before you came, going through motions, existing but not living. And then you arrived, all fierce competence and sharp edges, refusing to let me hide and work, forcing me to actually face what I'd been avoiding. You saved us, Lydia. All of us. I didn't do it alone, she protested, but her voice came out breathless. No. But you started it. You lit the spark that made us want to be better, do better. He reached up, touched her face with calloused fingers, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. This was supposed to be practical, a business arrangement, nothing more. I know, Lydia whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. But it's not anymore. Is it? No, she admitted. It's not. Caleb leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse. But Lydia didn't move except to tilt her face up toward his. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like the perfunctory brush at their wedding. This was real, soft and searching, tentative but full of promise. This was choosing, not settling. This was possibility instead of resignation. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, he said hoarsely. After Mary, I thought that part of me was dead, that I'd used up my capacity for this kind of feeling. And now? Lydia asked, though she was almost afraid of the answer. Now I'm terrified, he admitted, because carrying this much means risking loss again, means being vulnerable to the kind of pain that nearly destroyed me the first time. I'm scared too, Lydia confessed. I came here because I had no choice. I didn't expect to care about any of this, about you, about the children, about making this work for reasons beyond obligation. She pulled back slightly to look him in the eyes. But here we are anyway, and we can either run from it because it's frightening, or we can choose to see where it leads. I don't want to run anymore, Caleb said. I'm tired of running. Then don't, Lydia said simply. Stay, be present. Let this be real instead of pretend. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Lydia felt something inside her unlock and unfold, something she'd protected and hidden away because hoping had seemed too dangerous. But hope, she was learning, couldn't be controlled or contained. It grew wherever it found purchase, stubborn as prairie grass, resilient as children's laughter, impossible to kill no matter how harsh the conditions. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the quiet house. Two people who'd found each other through necessity, discovering that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to exactly where you needed to be. The following morning brought news that tested their fragile new equilibrium. A writer arrived from town carrying a message from the bank. Lydia saw Caleb's face go white as he read it, saw his hands shake before he crumpled the paper. What is it? She asked, dread pooling in her stomach. The bank's calling in the loan. They want payment in full within 30 days, or they're foreclosing. His voice was flat, shocked. We don't have that kind of money, even with the payment plan, even with the cattle sale coming up. We don't have enough. Lydia took the letter, read it herself. The language was cold and formal, but the message was clear: pay or lose everything. Her mind raced through possibilities, calculations, desperate alternatives. How much short are we? She asked. Even if the cattle sale brings top dollar, we're at least $800 short. $800. An impossible sum. Lydia thought about the ring on her finger, Mary's ring, wondered wildly if selling it would help. Then she thought about her grandmother's ring still tucked in the wooden box upstairs, the only thing of real value she owned. My ring, she said suddenly. My grandmother's ring. It's gold. It might be worth... No. Caleb's voice was firm. We're not selling your family heirlooms. There has to be another way. What other way? We've already negotiated with every creditor. We've cut expenses to the bone. Lydia stopped, struck by a sudden thought. The northern pasture. The one you said the Carsons have been wanting to buy for years. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's prime grazing land. Losing it would reduce our capacity significantly. Losing the entire ranch would reduce our capacity to zero, Lydia pointed out. If we sold that parcel, would it be enough? Maybe, if Carson's still interested and willing to pay fair value. Caleb looked anguished. But that land, Mary and I planned to pass it down to Ben someday. It was supposed to be his inheritance. Dead men can't inherit, Lydia said bluntly, and that's what you'll be if the bank forecloses, financially dead, unable to provide for your children at all. Better to sacrifice part of the dream than lose everything. Caleb stared at her, then slowly nodded. You're right. I hate it, but you're right. He reached for his hat. I'll ride to the Carson Ranch today, see if we can make a deal. We'll ride, Lydia corrected. I negotiate better than you do, remember? We do this together. He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful in his expression. Together, he agreed. They left Emma in charge of the younger children and rode out across the summer landscape, the grass golden in the heat, the mountains stark against the endless blue sky. The Carson Ranch was an hour's ride, prosperous and well-maintained, its success a reminder of what the Rowan Ranch could be with stability and resources. Jacob Carson was a weathered man in his 50s, shrewd but fair by reputation. He received them in his office, listened to their proposal with an unreadable expression. I've wanted that land for 10 years, he said when Caleb finished speaking. Good water access, excellent grass, but I never thought you'd actually sell. Circumstances change, Caleb said tightly. Carson named a price that made Lydia's stomach drop. It was less than half what the land was worth. She saw Caleb about to accept out of desperation and quickly interjected. That's an insulting offer, Mr. Carson, and you know it. The water rights alone are worth more than you're proposing. Carson's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Rowan, I'm doing your husband a favor even considering this purchase. No, you're taking advantage of a difficult situation to acquire valuable property at cut-rate prices, Lydia said evenly. Which is smart business, I suppose, but let's not pretend it's charity. That land is worth at least $1,500. We'll accept $1,200, not a penny less. That's more than I'm willing to pay. Then I guess we'll have to pursue other options, Lydia said, standing as if to leave. I'm sure the Mitchell family would be interested. They've been expanding their holdings. It was a bluff. She had no idea if the Mitchells wanted the land. But Carson's expression flickered, just slightly. The Mitchells don't have ready cash right now, he said. They're overextended from their spring purchases. Then we'll wait until they do, Lydia replied. We're not so desperate that we'll give away prime land for pennies on the dollar. Except they were exactly that desperate. But Carson didn't need to know that. Caleb watched this exchange with barely concealed amazement, staying silent, letting Lydia work. Carson studied her shrewdly. You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Rowan. I have to be, Mr. Carson. The frontier doesn't reward softness. He laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. Fair point. All right. 1,000 even. That's my final offer. 1,100, Lydia countered, and we maintain water rights for our remaining cattle through the end of the season. Carson considered, then extended his hand. Deal. But you drive a hard bargain. Thank you, Lydia said, shaking his hand firmly. The transaction was completed within the week. Carson paid in cash, counted out in the bank manager's office, while Lydia and Caleb watched. $1,100. Combined with the carefully managed funds from their payment plan, it was enough. Barely, but enough. The bank manager marked their loan as satisfied, handed over the deed to the ranch free and clear. Caleb held the paper with shaking hands, staring at it as if it might disappear. We did it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We actually did it. We did, Lydia agreed, feeling the weight of the past months settle and then lift. The ranch is ours, really ours. On the ride home, Caleb was quiet, processing. Finally, he said, You saved us again. If you hadn't negotiated that extra 100, we'd still be short. We'd have lost everything. We saved us, Lydia corrected. You had the courage to sell the land. I just helped get fair value for it. Ben's inheritance. Ben's inheritance is a father who's present and a ranch that will still be here when he's grown. That's worth more than any parcel of land. Caleb reached across the space between their horses, took her hand. I don't know what I did to deserve you walking into my life, but I'm grateful every day that you did. You didn't do anything, Lydia said softly. We were both just desperate enough to take a chance on something uncertain, and somehow it turned into something real. That evening, they gathered the children in the parlor. Caleb explained about selling the northern pasture, about the ranch now being secure, about their future being stable for the first time in years. The children's faces showed varying degrees of understanding, but the relief was universal. Does this mean we get to stay? Claire asked, her voice small. We don't have to leave? We get to stay, Caleb confirmed, pulling her onto his lap. This is our home. It's going to stay our home. James cheered. Alice clapped her hands without understanding why. Ben looked at his father with something like pride. And Emma. Emma looked at Lydia with tears streaming down her face. Thank you, the girl mouthed silently. Lydia nodded, her own throat too tight to speak. Later, after the children were asleep, Lydia sat in the kitchen with her writing materials, composing the letter she'd been planning for weeks. The words came slowly, carefully chosen to convey everything she needed her mother to know. She wrote about the children, about Emma's fierce protection and Ben's buried grief and Clara's sweetness. She wrote about the ranch, about Montana's vast skies and difficult beauty. She wrote about Caleb, about how the practical arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had expected. And she wrote about herself, about discovering strengths she hadn't known she possessed, about finding purpose in caring for this cobbled-together family, about understanding that sometimes the life you don't choose can become the life you wouldn't trade for anything. She sealed the letter, set it aside to mail in the morning. Then she took out her grandmother's wooden box, opened it to look at the ring inside. She'd thought, when she left Missouri, that this ring represented the only kind of marriage worth having, one built on love from the beginning, tested by time, unshaken by hardship. But maybe there were other kinds of marriages worth having too. Ones that started with necessity and grew into partnership. Ones that began with strangers and transformed into family. Ones that didn't follow the expected path but ended up somewhere beautiful anyway. Footsteps behind her made her turn. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Different kinds of love," Lydia said honestly. "Different paths to the same destination." He crossed to her, looked down at the ring in the box. "That's beautiful. It was my grandmother's. My mother gave it to me before I left." Lydia touched it gently. "I thought I'd wear it someday, when I got married for real." "And wearing Mary's ring doesn't count as real?" There was no accusation in his voice, just curiosity. Lydia looked up at him, at this man who'd started as a stranger and become something precious. It didn't at first, but it does now. Caleb knelt beside her chair, took her hands in his. "Lydia Rowan, I know we did this backward. I know we started with a contract instead of courtship, with necessity instead of romance. But I want you to know, what I feel for you now is real. You're not a hired hand or a solution to my problems. You're my partner, my friend, my—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "My love, if you'll have me. Not because a piece of paper says we're married, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." Lydia's vision blurred with tears. "I choose you too," she whispered. "This wasn't the life I imagined, but it's the life I want. These children, this ranch, this partnership, I wouldn't trade any of it." He stood, pulled her to her feet, kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally pulled apart, he took her grandmother's ring from the box, slipped it onto her right hand opposite Mary's ring on her left. "Both," he said simply. "Honor where you came from and where you are now. Both parts of you matter." Lydia looked at the two rings, one representing the past and lost dreams, one representing the present and chosen reality. Together they told the story of who she was, a girl from Missouri who became a woman in Montana, someone who'd been sold to settle debts and found a family instead, a person who'd learned that the strongest foundations were often built from the rubble of broken plans. The summer deepened into richness, the ranch thriving under their combined efforts. The cattle sale brought good prices. The garden produced bountifully. The children bloomed like flowers finally given proper soil and sunlight. Ben began smiling again, his anger softening into the normal rebelliousness of an 11-year-old boy instead of the sharp edge of abandonment. He and Caleb went fishing regularly, just the two of them, rebuilding connection cast by cast. Emma slowly released her grip on constant responsibility, allowing herself moments of genuine childhood. Lydia taught her to braid hair in elaborate patterns, and they spent evenings on the porch practicing while Clara watched and James played nearby. Sometimes Emma would lean against Lydia's shoulder, just absorbing the comfort of not having to be the strong one for a while. Clara's fears eased as consistency proved reliable. She stopped testing whether people would disappear, stopped waking in the night crying for her mother. She adopted a barn kitten and poured her nurturing energy into caring for it, learning that love didn't always end in loss. James's nightmares faded. He still remembered Mary, but the memories became sweeter instead of painful. He started calling Lydia Mama Lydia to distinguish her from Mama Mary, and Lydia's heart swelled every time she heard it. And Alice, who'd never known anything different, simply accepted Lydia as the constant female presence in her life, climbing into her lap for stories, reaching for her hand when walking, crying for her when hurt. The little girl had no memory of Mary, but she had Lydia, and that was enough. On a perfect August evening, with the sun setting gold and amber over the mountains, the family gathered on the porch after supper. Caleb sat with Alice on his lap, Emma and Clara on the steps, Ben leaning against the railing, James sprawled on the floor. Lydia rocked gently in the chair that had been Mary's, feeling the rhythm of family life that had become hers. "Tell us a story, Mama Lydia," James demanded, "one with treasure and fighting." "And horses," Ben added. "And a brave girl," Clara chimed in. Lydia laughed, looked at Caleb, who smiled at her with love uncomplicated by ghosts or obligations. She thought about the story she could tell, about a girl sent away to save her family, about a widowed rancher desperate for help, about 5 children learning to heal, about 2 people finding each other in the wreckage of difficult circumstances and building something beautiful from the pieces. But instead she said, "Once upon a time, there was a kingdom in the mountains where the sky was so big you could see forever. And the people who lived there learned that family wasn't just about blood or birth, but about choice and commitment and showing up day after day even when things were hard." She wove the story while the stars emerged overhead, while the children listened with rapt attention, while Caleb watched her with eyes that held promises and futures, and the kind of love that grew from shared work and honest vulnerability. Later, when the children were asleep, and she and Caleb stood together looking out at their land, truly theirs now, secured and stable, he pulled her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming here, leaving your family, taking a chance on this uncertain life?" Lydia thought about Missouri, about her mother and siblings safe in their house, about the debts paid and the future secured. She thought about the girl she'd been, scared and desperate, and convinced she was sacrificing herself for nothing. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong and capable and loved, rooted in this Montana soil, claimed by these children, choosing this man and this life every single day. "No," she said with absolute certainty. "I don't regret it. Not for a moment." "Good," Caleb murmured against her hair. "Because I can't imagine any of this without you. You're the heart of this family now, the foundation everything else is built on." Lydia turned in his arms, kissed him deeply, poured into it all the things words couldn't quite capture, gratitude and hope, and hard-won joy, and the fierce determination to protect this precious thing they'd built together. When they finally drew apart, she rested her head against his chest, listened to his heartbeat, steady and sure. She'd come to Montana as a transaction, a girl sold to settle debts. But she'd become something far more valuable, a partner, a mother, a woman who'd discovered her own strength in the crucible of necessity and transformed it into choice. The contract that had brought her here was just paper, its terms fulfilled and forgotten. What mattered now was the unwritten agreement they renewed each day, to show up, to care, to build something lasting from the raw materials of broken plans and unexpected grace. In the years to come, people in Silver Ridge would speak of the Rowan Ranch's transformation, how it had gone from struggling and sad to thriving and full of life. They'd talk about Caleb Rowan, who'd learned to be present for his children instead of hiding in work. They'd mention Emma's laughter, Ben's confidence, Clara's fearlessness, James's joy, Alice's bright energy. But mostly they'd talk about Lydia Rowan, the girl who'd arrived with nothing and changed everything, who'd proven that sometimes the most beautiful gardens really did grow from the hardest ground, who'd shown that love could be chosen just as powerfully as it could be felt, who'd transformed a business arrangement into a family and a house into a home. And Lydia, hearing these stories years later with Silver threading her dark hair and Caleb's grandchildren playing at her feet, would smile and think about that frightened 19-year-old girl stepping off the stagecoach into an uncertain future. She'd want to tell that girl what she'd learned in all the years between, that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about moving forward despite fear. That family wasn't about perfect beginnings. It was about imperfect people choosing each other day after day. That sometimes the life you didn't choose was exactly the life you needed, if only you were brave enough to claim it. But mostly she'd want to tell that girl what she knew now, with bone-deep certainty. That she hadn't been sold into this life. She'd grown into it. And in growing, she'd found everything she'd never known she was looking for. Home, purpose, love, belonging. All of it waiting for her in the Montana wilderness, beneath the endless sky, in the arms of a man who'd started as a stranger and become her whole world, surrounded by children who'd started as obligations and become her greatest joy. The summer contract had promised $300 and a practical arrangement, but it had delivered something far more valuable, a life worth living, a family worth fighting for, and a love worth every risk she'd taken to find it. And that, Lydia knew, was worth more than all the money in the world.